Hello YouTube! So a little while ago I uploaded a video on self-defeating theories, and I pointed out that in philosophy and science, and I suppose inquiry in general, there's been a shift away from thinking of theories as being true to thinking of theories as being approximately true, right? The aim is approximate truth rather than just perfect truth, right? And I suggested that if we are thinking in terms of approximate truth, it may not be a problem if theories are self-defeating. So I'll link that video in the comments. But what I want to do today is talk about some other consequences of thinking in terms of approximate truth, particularly what this might mean for logical validity. So, so we draw this distinction between deductive and non-deductive inferences. Deductive inferences are necessarily truth-preserving. So in the case of a deductive inference, if you have true premises and the inference is logically valid, the form is logically valid, then you will necessarily have a true conclusion. So think of modus ponens, for instance. If P then Q, P therefore Q. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So, and it's, I mean, there's different accounts of why deductive inferences are necessarily truth-preserving. But it's, so one idea might be, well, in the case of a deductive inference, there's a sense in which the conclusion says nothing more than what is already said in the premises. And indeed, sometimes the conclusion says less than what is said in the premises. So in the case of modus ponens, if I say, if P then Q, P therefore Q, or if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, the thought is that the content of the conclusion, the claim that Socrates is mortal, that's already contained within the premises. I've already asserted it as part of the premises. So if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Okay, one of the things that we care a lot about in philosophy is figuring out which forms of inference are deductively valid. So which forms of inference are such that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And I mean, most philosophers think that there are sort of universal laws of deductive logic. There are actually some interesting challenges to the idea that there are laws of logic. I will again link a couple of videos I've done in the comments on that point. But assume that this is right. Assume that there actually are universal laws of logic, right? Well, so the thought is, well, even if we grant that, I think it's going to still be the case that when we are evaluating arguments for deductive validity, or rather that what I want to suggest is that it only really makes sense to be evaluating arguments for deductive validity in cases where we're assuming that the premises could be true. But if we start thinking in terms of approximate truth, it's not so clear. It's not so clear that assessing arguments for deductive validity makes much sense. So, so first of all, I mean, this idea of that perhaps approximate truth is the best that we can get. I mean, certainly the vast majority of the claims that we make about the world in natural language are claims that are only going to be approximately true. We're going to make all sorts of simplifications, idealizations, etc. So here's a nice example from Paul Teller. Let's say I want to figure out what is the speed of sound in the Sydney Opera House, for instance. Well, okay, so there's going to be, I assume there's going to be some sort of answer to that, right? I'm going to say the speed of sound in the Sydney Opera House is X, right? But the problem with this is, well, first of all, what exactly counts as the Sydney Opera House? Does the Sydney Opera House cover, are we counting just the auditorium, or are we also including the vestibule? Like which bits? Right? There's all sorts of different ways of drawing the lines around what this object, the Sydney Opera House, is supposed to be. In fact, there's like an infinite number of ways of drawing the line around what that object is supposed to be. And then how do we specify the conditions inside the Sydney Opera House? Do we take it with the door open or shut? Do we take it with air conditioning on or off? Do we fill it with the audience or keep it empty? Etc. Again, different conditions inside the opera house will change what the speed of sound is. And then however we specify the conditions inside the opera house, there are just going to be, it's likely that within that object there will not be uniform environmental conditions. So like there's going to be temperature changes throughout the air, and that will affect the speed of sound. So there isn't really any such thing as the speed of sound in the Sydney Opera House. Like strictly speaking, the speed of sound in the Sydney Opera House just has no value. But of course, we don't speak strictly. We idealize, we approximate, and we just have no choice but to do that. And so this is one reason to think that even when we're engaging in fairly in sort of inquiries where we want to be fairly precise, there's not really going to be any way of completely escaping idealization and approximation. Like the most that we can get are approximately true descriptions of the world. That's one reason. Okay, maybe we think that the best we can achieve are approximately true theories, but now must deductive inference preserve approximate truth? Well, no. I mean, obviously not. So it could be the case that we have a theory which says X, Y, Z, right? And it might be the case that this theory is approximately true. So X, Y, Z together as a theory, that's approximately true. But then if we look at one specific part of that theory, X, that might just be false. So if you think about, I don't know, modeling the sun, you might model the sun as if it's composed of an ideal gas, and maybe what you get there is an approximately true model of the sun. I mean, so it might be that if we're thinking about the, larger scale structure of the sun, like its convection currents in the sun or something, then you get an approximately true story about that. But the idea of an ideal gas, a bunch of like dimensionless particles that there's no intermolecular friction, etc. I mean that's just false, right? Or a claim, the claim that objects have determinate boundaries, for instance. Well, that's just false. You can have a theory where it commits to a number of different claims, and some of those claims are going to be just false. So the fact that the theory is approximately true isn't going to allow you to infer that some specific part of the theory is true. So that means that you don't get conjunction elimination, so from A and B entails A, right? Well, that's a very basic law of deductive logic, but it's just not applicable if the best we can do is approximate truth. Similarly, conjunction introduction, right? It could be that X is approximately true and that Y is approximately true, but then the conjunction X and Y is just false. That might not meet our standards for approximate truth. So you don't get conjunction introduction. And so, you'll find similarly, like any supposed logical law or deductive law, it seems it doesn't really make sense to apply it in the case of approximate truth, at least not strictly speaking. Again, we can perhaps treat it as an idealization or something, but then it looks like, again, at least strictly speaking, the scope of deduction is going to be extremely limited. Maybe it's just limited to formal systems like mathematics or something, but in terms of theories about the empirical world, and certainly any theory that's stated in natural language, I mean, okay, we might be able to say something like this. If I state an argument in natural language, then of course I can say, well, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So, if it's the case that modus ponens is a deductive law, and I have the premises if P then Q, P therefore Q, P, and then I have the conclusion Q, then I can say if those premises are true, then the conclusion is true, right? But the point is that if I'm aiming for approximate truth, then I'm not claiming that the premises are true. And if I'm aiming for approximate truth, then I mean, I can't say, well, if the premises are approximately true, then the conclusion is approximately true, because approximate truth is not preserved deductively. So if we think, even if we think that there are universal laws of logic, that there is, one true logic or something like that, it looks like it's going to be inapplicable in most cases. It's certainly going to be irrelevant to most natural language arguments. So I think another way to see the limits of deductive logic is to note that this point about approximation and idealization is also going to apply to concepts. So, I mean, we know that equivocation is a fallacy, right? I mean, like, consider the argument, I might say, for instance, only men are rational, women are not men, therefore women are not rational, something like that, right? Now, obviously the response to this is, well, okay, you're just equivocating on the term man, right? The term man is being used in different ways throughout that argument. So in the first premise, I'm using the term man to refer to a kind of persons, or maybe humans, or something like that. Whereas in the second premise, I'm using the term man to refer to male humans. So obviously, that argument is not going to be deductively valid. In order for an argument to be deductively valid, it has to be the case that terms are being used the same way throughout. There's no equivocation. But now let's kind of think about the consequences of this point that, okay, we always idealize, we always approximate. So take again the argument, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Is there an equivocation in that argument? Well, okay, what exactly does Socrates refer to? I mean, we're assuming that the term Socrates is being used the same way throughout the argument, but what way is that? I mean, Socrates picks out a particular individual, but which individual? I mean, obviously there's all sorts of different ways of drawing the line around Socrates. I mean, are we talking about Socrates over like an entire biological lifespan? Like, do we count from conception to the point where the body has completely decomposed? Or are we kind of just talking about, say, an adult man, like, 30 to 50 years old, or something like that? Are we kind of narrowing the range to some point where, we have, like, the paradigmatic Socrates? We might be thinking of something even more specific, right? We might be thinking of some old guy who's going around annoying people in Athens. Similarly, how do we draw the lines around the body? Like, do you include the gut microbiota as being part of the individual, or is it like some other organism that exists symbiotically with the individual? Again, there's all sorts of different ways of drawing the lines here. Is Socrates referring to that? In fact, Socrates could even be kind of referring to a sort of mixture of, like, a real person and then certain fictional accounts or certain false accounts, right? Not everything that's written about Socrates is going to be accurate, and so maybe what we're referring to is this weird, like, mixed object or something like that. So okay, the concept Socrates doesn't have, like, a clear determinate reference. Similarly, if you think about man and mortal, I mean, the boundaries of these things are very vague. I mean, that's clearly the case for man, right? I mean, so man here, I assume, means human being. But who counts as a human being? I mean, if you roll the tape back far enough, there's going to be, just a sort of unbroken chain from, single cell all the way up to human beings. It's not really clear where you draw the line, right? So in all of these cases, the boundaries of all these things are vague, and I think it's also going to be the case that the the concepts that we're invoking to refer to these things are going to be vague as well. What is the concept? So like the concept man or the concept Socrates. Different people are going to have different things in mind. And in fact, even the same person is going to have different things in mind over time. What I'm thinking about Socrates today is going to be slightly different to what I think about Socrates tomorrow. So, the thought is, well, even when it comes to concepts, there's not like any strict fact of the matter. Like what counts as the same concept. So if there's no fact of the matter, what counts as the same concept, then there's no fact of the matter whether an argument involves an equivocation. Like if you decide to divide concepts up in a fine-grained enough way, then even the argument concerning Socrates' mortality is going to contain an equivocation. Because we're not using. So when I say if Socrates is man, then Socrates is mortal. Well, boom! I'm already using a different concept when I say Socrates the second time. I think what I would rather say is that actually in both cases the concept is just sort of not really determinate what the concept is that I'm using. Just for another example of this, consider for instance the concept swan, right? We used to think that all swans were white, and then we discovered that some swans are not white. That's the usual story, right? We made this discovery that there are some black swans. But actually, that's not quite right. I mean, there's some sense in which we had to make a decision. So the decision is that so we could have decided when people went to Australia or wherever it was and they observed some very swan-like birds that were black, they could have made the decision that actually just by definition, swan refers to birds that are white. So actually these black swan-like birds are not really swans. So if you ask the question, so prior to the discovery of what we would call black swans, if you ask the question, could there be black swans? Well, I mean, it's like there's not really any determinate fact of the matter because on observing a black swan-like bird, yes, you can just take it that this is a black swan, or you could say, well, no, it's part of the definition of swan that a swan is white. And so there can't be black swans. In fact, even today, there's a great deal of conceptual indeterminacy or conceptual pluralism with respect to the concept swan. So if you think about the concept swan as it's used in biology, what exactly is a swan? Well, one way that biologists will use the term is to refer to reproductively isolated groups of organisms. So one way that biologists think of species is in terms of reproductive isolation. So if you have a group of organisms that, interbreed with each other but not with other organisms, then they're part of the same species. So one way to think about swans is as these reproductively isolated group of organisms. Of course, what counts as reproductive isolation is itself, there's plenty of debate about that. There's different ways of drawing the lines. Like, is it enough for there to just be a kind of geographical barrier, or do you need there to be like genetic barriers or whatever? Similarly, another way that the term swan is used in biology is you can define it in terms of phylogeny. So you can say that it's a group composed of a common ancestor and all of its current descendants. And then on that definition, you have there's a type of swan known as a Coscoroba swan, I think that's it. Coscoroba, I might be pronouncing it wrong. Coscoroba swan, they are not considered to be true swans. But I mean, like, what is a true swan? I mean, on the colloquial use of the term swan, Coscoroba swans are they're perfectly fine examples of swans, right? So we have this kind of we have a bunch of technical biological concepts. We have a bunch of colloquial concepts. When I say swan, I mean, am I invoking the colloquial concept, or am I invoking some technical biological concept, or what? I mean, I'm inclined to say there's just no fact of the matter about that. It's just indeterminate. And so, yeah, I mean, if I present some sort of argument invoking this concept swan, well, like whether that argument, well, okay, the concept swan, it's just indeterminate what concept I'm evoking, so it's going to be indeterminate whether or not there is an equivocation going on in that argument. Like you could just, if it would be perfectly legitimate to interpret the argument as invoking different concepts each time I say the word swan. And of course, it would be perfectly legitimate to take the argument as invoking the same concept throughout. That's fine as well, but there's no fact to the matter. So yes, what I would suggest is that if we take seriously this idea that all of the claims we make about the world are at best approximately true, that we're constantly idealizing, simplifying, abstracting, approximating, then it seems like it seems like formal logic so when we assess an argument for deductive validity, that is going to be at best just another idealization, and strictly speaking, it's not clear that it makes that much sense to even apply this tool of deductive, of like analyzing the deductive validity of an argument. It's not clear that that's even applicable, strictly speaking, to natural language arguments, to arguments that where at best we're aiming for approximate truth. Okay then, so that's that. Thanks for watching.